The frontier had no shortage of killers, thieves, and desperate men. But when people spoke of Silas Boone, their voices dropped to a whisper. Some called him a ghost. Others swore he was the devil riding on a black horse. What mattered wasn't the truth, but the fact that every outlaw from Kansas to New Mexico knew his name and feared it. Silas wasn't a big man, not in the way of lumbering giants who could crush skulls with their fists. His menace came from the silence that followed him, the cold steadiness of his gaze, and the way he drew his revolver without a word, faster than most men could breathe. He never smiled, never lingered long in any town, and never missed a shot. Bounty posters nailed to saloon walls were his hunting lists, and he pursued them without hesitation. Horse thieves, killers, deserters. Silas brought them in, dead or alive, though more often dead. He lived on the edge of the law, trusted by sheriffs who couldn't do the dirty work themselves. To most, he was just another shadow passing through, a reminder of death's certainty on the frontier. And yet behind the legends, Silas lived a life of quiet solitude. His cabin sat at the edge of a scrubland valley, where the prairie grass turned yellow in the heat and coyotes sang at night. He kept no company, save for his dark stallion and the Winchester rifle that leaned beside his door. Neighbors, if they could be called that, learned long ago not to disturb him. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't whore like other bounty hunters. Instead, he kept to himself, mending tack, sharpening blades, and studying the trails of men worth more dead than alive. A man like him couldn't afford softness. The frontier chewed up the weak and spat them out. Silas had long ago decided he'd rather be the one doing the chewing. But solitude had its price. In the dead of night, when the fire burned low, memories came creeping back, faces of men he'd killed, screams of women caught in the crossfire, the empty silence after the gun smoke cleared. He told himself it was the cost of survival. Still, every now and then, he caught himself staring at the horizon, wondering what lay beyond this endless hunt. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky split with jagged streaks of lightning, and thunder shook the valley floor. Silas sat in his cabin, oiling his revolver, when the rain began to drum against the roof. He had half a mind to ride out at first light for his next quarry, a stagecoach robber hiding near Santa Fe, but the storm made him linger. The stallion stamped in the barn, uneasy. Silas frowned, set aside the revolver, and grabbed the lantern. He'd lived long enough to know when something was amiss. Out in the barn, the air smelled of hay and damp earth. The horse shifted nervously in its stall, ears pinned back, eyes rolling white. Silas narrowed his gaze. There it was, a faint rustling, too light to be an animal. His hand drifted to the revolver at his hip. Someone was in his barn. He moved without a sound, boots crunching softly in the straw. The lantern threw long, shifting shadows across the walls, illuminating the rafters and hay bales. He stopped, listening. There, behind the haystack, a breath, quick and shallow, with one swift motion, Silas drew his revolver and leveled it. "Come out," he said, his voice low, steady as steel. For a moment, nothing. Then, a small figure shifted into the lantern light. Not an outlaw, not a hardened gunman, but a girl. Young, pale, with blood on her dress. Her wide eyes glistened with fear, her hands clutching her side. She swayed, nearly collapsing before bracing herself against the hay. Silas blinked, caught off guard for the first time in years. A wounded girl hiding in his barn. He had hunted killers across the frontier, but this was something different. And though he didn't know it, yet that moment would change the course of his life forever. The storm outside raged like a wild animal. Rain hammered against the roof of Silas Boone's cabin, and the wind howled through the cracks in the shutters. Most men would have shut their doors and prayed the storm passed quickly. But Silas wasn't like most men. He didn't pray, and He didn't ignore his instincts. When his stallion snorted and stamped in the barn, Silas felt the old familiar coil of tension wind in his gut. Animals had a way of sensing danger before men ever did. He set his revolver into its holster, grabbed the lantern off the table, and stepped into the storm. The barn loomed against the lightning-lit sky, dark and silent except for the restless shifting of the horse inside. Silas pushed the door open, the hinges groaning, and the scent of wet hay filled his nose. The lantern's glow stretched long shadows across the ground. At first he thought maybe a raccoon or coyote had slipped inside, but the sound he heard wasn't the scurrying of paws. It was slower, heavier. A rustle, followed by a faint, shaky breath. His hand slid to his revolver. Quietly, he stepped across the straw-strewn floor. Every muscle in his body was coiled, tight, his senses sharpened. He had lived too long in this world to be careless. "Who's there?" His voice was low, dangerous, carrying the kind of authority that had made outlaws throw down their guns. Silence. The horse pawed the ground, nervous, its ears flicking back toward the far stall. Silas lifted the lantern higher, casting light, into the corners of the barn. Behind a stack of hay bales, something shifted. "Out," he ordered, revolver drawn now, steady in his hand. Slow. For a moment he expected some desperate drifter to crawl out, or maybe a wounded outlaw trying to steal shelter. What he did not expect was the figure that emerged. She was young, no more than 17 or 18, her face pale beneath the dirt and rain. Her dress clung to her, torn and stained with blood. She looked like she had been running for days. Wide eyes, fever bright, stared at him as if he were the executioner come to deliver the final blow. She swayed on her feet, one hand clutching her side, and then nearly collapsed against the hay. Silas caught himself from taking a step forward. Instinct told him to stay cautious. Wounded or not, people could still be dangerous. "Please." Her voice was little more than a whisper. "Don't turn me in." Silas narrowed his eyes. Turn her in? That meant someone was after her. And if someone wanted her found, then she carried trouble like a storm cloud. He studied her for a long moment. She was no outlaw. That much was clear. She had the look of someone hunted, not someone who did the hunting. Still, a part of him itched to demand answers right there. Who was she? What had she done? And why had fate delivered her to his doorstep? Instead, he holstered his revolver and stepped closer, lantern raised. Her dress was soaked through, and the blood spreading across the fabric wasn't old. It was fresh. She wouldn't last long if he left her where she was. "Can you stand?" he asked. Her lips trembled as she nodded, though it was clear she couldn't. Silas didn't waste time. He bent down, lifted her into his arms as though she weighed no more than a sack of feathers, and carried her out into the rain. The storm lashed against them as he crossed the short distance back to his cabin. Inside, the fire still burned low. He laid her gently on his bunk, the lantern casting a warm glow over her pale features. For the first time in years, Silas Boone, the most feared bounty hunter in the territory, hesitated. She was a stranger, a wounded girl who brought danger straight into his home. But something in her broken whisper had unsettled him. "Don't turn me in." Silas Boone had hunted men without mercy. But now, for reasons he Silas Boone set the lantern on the table and knelt beside the bunk. The girl's breaths came ragged, shallow, each one edged with pain. She looked as if she hadn't eaten in days, her cheeks hollow, her lips cracked from thirst. The blood on her dress had soaked through the coarse fabric, staining the blanket beneath her. He wasn't a doctor, but a man who spent his life on the trail learned a thing or two about wounds. Carefully, Silas tugged at the torn fabric near her side. She flinched, her eyes snapping open in alarm. "Easy," he muttered, his voice low and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her gaze flicked to the revolver on his hip. then back to his face. Fear lingered in her eyes, but she didn't fight him. Maybe she was too weak to. Maybe she saw something in his expression that told her she was safe. For now. Silas examined the wound. A gash cut across her ribs, deep but not fatal. If tended properly, whoever had done it hadn't aimed to kill her outright, at least not yet. That alone made his jaw tighten. He reached for a basin, poured in water, and tore strips from a clean shirt. The girl's breath hissed through her teeth as he pressed the cloth against her side, washing away blood and grit. She clenched her fists in the blanket, her eyes glistening. "What's your name?" Silas asked, not looking up from his work. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, in a voice soft as rain, she whispered, "Clara." He nodded once, tying a strip of cloth around her wound to staunch the bleeding. "Well, Clara, looks like you found the wrong barn to crawl into." Her lips curved in the faintest ghost of a smile, though it vanished quickly. I thought I was going to die out there," she murmured. "The storm... I couldn't run any farther. You shouldn't be running at all, not in that condition." He sat back, studying her. "Who's after you?" At that, her face tightened, and she turned away. "Does it matter?" Silas frowned. It mattered to him. If men came looking, they wouldn't care that his cabin was his sanctuary. They'd burn it to the ground if it meant finding her. He opened his mouth to press her, but stopped himself. Pushing now would get him nowhere. Instead, he pulled a tin cup from the shelf, filled it with water, and held it out. Clara's trembling hands reached for it, but she nearly spilled it in her weakness. Silas steadied the cup with one hand while she drank greedily. When she finished, he set it aside. "You'll rest here tonight. Tomorrow we'll see what kind of trouble's on your heels." Her eyes widened. "You'd let me stay?" Silas almost smirked, though his face barely shifted. "You're bleeding all over my blanket. Can't exactly throw you back into the storm, can I?" She blinked, startled at the trace of dry humor in his tone. For a moment, her expression softened, as though she wanted to thank him. But exhaustion claimed her before she could speak. Her eyes closed, and her breathing steadied into a shallow rhythm. Silas sat back in the chair by the fire, revolver resting across his lap. He kept his gaze on her, his thoughts churning. He had spent years keeping the world at arm's length, killing for coin, trusting no one. And now, in a single night, fate had dropped a wounded girl into his barn. He didn't know who she was, running from. He didn't know why men wanted her dead. But one thing was certain. Sheltering Clara would draw danger straight to his doorstep. Silas Boone, the most feared bounty hunter in the territory, had built a life on avoiding entanglements. Yet here he sat, watching over a stranger like some kind of guardian, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he didn't regret it. Not one bit. Morning came slow and gray. The storm had broken during the night, leaving the earth heavy with rain, and the sky streaked with low, rolling clouds. Silas Boone stood at the cabin window, a cup of black coffee in hand, watching the mist curl over the hills. It was quiet, too quiet for his liking. Behind him, Clara stirred. He turned, his gaze sharp as always, though softened slightly when he saw her struggling to sit up. Her face was pale, her hair tangled, and the bandage at her side already stained through. She looked fragile, but her eyes, though weary, held a spark of defiance. "You should be lying down," Silas said. "I've been lying down for days," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I can't keep running if I stay still." "You won't be running anywhere for a while." He set the coffee aside and moved to the table, tearing more cloth for bandages. "Your ribs are torn up bad. You keep moving, you'll bleed yourself dry." Clara hesitated, then lowered herself back against the bunk with a sigh. "Why are you helping me?" Silas glanced at her. Because you'd already be dead if I hadn't. Don't read more into it. That silenced her for a moment. But as he cleaned the wound again, she flinched, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. Not just from the sting of the water. Silas knew that look. He'd seen it in dying men, in those who'd lost everything. You gonna tell me who cut you? Up? He asked, keeping his voice calm, steady. Clara looked away, staring at the cabin wall. I can't. Can't or won't. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Silas studied her, weighing the options. He'd been lied to plenty of times, and he'd learned to hear the difference between silence born of guilt and silence born of fear. Clara's was the latter. She wasn't hiding something for herself. She was hiding it because speaking it out loud terrified her. You've got people after you, Silas said, more a statement than a question. That much is clear. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. If I tell you, you'll turn me in. That gave him pause. The girl knew enough of the world to believe even a man who saved her life couldn't be trusted. And why should she? Bounty hunters weren't known for mercy. I'd have left you in the barn if I meant to do that, he said evenly. Her eyes flicked to him then, searching his face as if trying to see past the reputation she must have heard whispered in towns. Whatever she saw there must have been enough because her shoulders slumped. My father, she said at last, her voice trembling. He worked for them, men who steal, kill, whatever they want. He thought he could cheat them, thought he could take what they'd stolen and disappear. Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't need her to explain who them was. Gangs like that ran half the frontier, ruthless men who didn't forgive betrayal. They found out, Clara continued, her hands twisting in the blanket. He's dead now, and they think I know where he hid the money. Her words hung in the room like a death sentence. Silas leaned back, his expression unreadable. So that was it. The girl wasn't just some unlucky runaway. She was the last loose thread in a web of blood and revenge. As long as she breathed, those men would hunt her to the ends of the earth. You know where it is? He asked quietly. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. No, he never told me. But they don't believe that. Silas stared at the fire, his mind turning. Protecting her meant dragging himself into a fight that wasn't his. He could send her away, wash his hands of it. But looking at her, wounded, trembling, clinging to what little courage she had left, he knew he wouldn't. For years, Silas Boone had lived by a simple code. No attachments, no distractions. But Clara's past had already wound itself into his, whether he liked it or The storm left the land washed clean, but the air carried a sharp edge of unease. Silas Boone knew quiet never lasted long on the frontier, not when blood had been spilled and money was at stake. He saddled his stallion at first light, eyes scanning the hills. Clara watched from the cabin doorway, her face pale, bandages showing beneath the loose shirt he'd given her. She leaned heavily against the frame, still too weak to stand long, but restless all the same. You're going into town, she said, her voice carrying both fear and accusation. I need supplies, bandages, powder, ammunition. Silas tightened the cinch. You'll stay here. Her eyes widened. What if they find me? Silas looked up at her, his gaze hard and steady. They won't. Not today. But even as he said it, he knew men like the ones hunting her didn't rest. Word spread fast on the frontier. A girl on the run, bleeding, desperate. There would be talk, whispers in every saloon and stable. He couldn't keep her hidden forever. The ride into town was quiet, save for the jingle of tack and the creak of leather. Silas kept to the edges of the road, always watching, always listening. When he reached the small settlement of Dry Creek, the place already buzzed with life. Wagons rattling, miners loading supplies, ranch hands tying horses outside the saloon. He swung down from his stallion, tying it at the hitching post outside. The Mercantile. That was when he noticed them, strangers, 3 of them, sitting stiff in the shade near the blacksmith's. They weren't locals. He knew every face in this dusty excuse for a town. These men had the look of wolves sniffing the wind, hard eyes, trail dust on their coats, hands never far from their belts. One of them, a tall, narrow-eyed man with a scar cutting across his jaw, watched Silas a little too long before turning back to his companions. Silas didn't break stride, but every instinct screamed at him. They weren't here for supplies. They were asking questions. Inside the Mercantile, he kept his movements calm, steady, but his ears picked up the murmur of voices outside. Girl, young, maybe 18, wounded. Boss says she knows where the money is. Check every ranch, every cabin. Silas's jaw tightened as he paid for the bandages, bullets, and a sack of flour. The men weren't bothering to hide what they were after. That meant they were confident, too confident, and confident men were dangerous. As he left the store, the narrow-eyed stranger glanced his way again. There was a pause, subtle but sharp, like a match struck in the dark. Silas met his gaze, cold and unflinching, before mounting his horse. Neither man spoke, but an understanding passed between them. By the time Silas rode out of town, his decision was made. They were already on her trail. It wouldn't be long before they came knocking. Back at the cabin, Clara looked up quickly when he entered. "Did anyone see you?" "They saw me," Silas said, setting the supplies down. "But they weren't looking for me." Her face drained of color. "They're close, aren't they?" Silas met her eyes. "Closer than I'd like." She wrapped her arms around herself, her fear raw and unhidden. "You should let me go. I'm bringing this to your door." Silas shook his head. "If they find you alone, they'll kill you. Before you can take another step, you'll stay here. We'll handle them when the time comes." She stared at him, bewildered. "Why would you risk yourself for me? You don't even know me." Silas didn't answer right away. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle with slow, deliberate motions. Finally, he said, "Maybe I don't need to know you. Maybe it's enough that they want you dead." Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Trouble was coming. Silas could feel it in his bones. And for the first time in years, the hunter knew what it felt like to be the hunted. By nightfall, Boone had already set his mind to war. He knew the type of men hunting Clara. Wolves didn't stop until they tasted blood, and these wolves had already caught the scent. The cabin sat quiet under the cover of dusk, firelight flickering against the walls. Clara lay resting on the bunk, her breathing steadier now, but her face still pale. She watched Silas as he moved about the cabin, checking the rifle by the door, counting cartridges, sliding a knife into his boot. "You think they'll come tonight?" she whispered. "I think they'll come when they're ready," Silas said without looking at her. "And I'd be a fool to think they won't find me." She sat up slightly, wincing at the pull in her side. "Why not run? You could leave me here. They only want me." Silas's hand stilled on the rifle stock. He turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting hers with the kind of cold weight that made most men flinch. But Clara didn't flinch. She just looked back at him, confused, almost pleading. "Running never solved a damn thing," he said at last. "If you run, they'll chase. If you hide, they'll burn the world down around you. Only way it ends is if they're put in the ground." His voice carried no bravado, no fire, just simple fact, as if he were describing the weather. Clara shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization of just who was standing before her, a man who had spent his life ending others. Before she could speak, a sound split the night. A sharp crack, hooves on the ridge. Silas blew out the lantern and moved to the window. The moon had broken through the clouds, spilling silver light over the valley. Across the ridgeline, 3 riders crept along, their silhouettes clear against The horizon. More shadows shifted below them, fanning out like a pack closing in on prey. "They found us," Clara breathed. "No," Silas muttered, his eyes narrowing. "They found me." He grabbed his rifle, swung the door open, and stepped onto the porch. The cool night air bit at his skin, but he felt nothing but the calm stillness that always came before a fight. One of the riders called out, his voice carrying across the field. "Boone, we know she's in there. Hand the girl over, and maybe we'll let you live." Silas's jaw tightened. It wasn't the first time he'd been threatened, but this was different. They knew his name. They'd done their homework. Which meant this wasn't just about Clara. It was about breaking him, too. He raised the rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the valley, and one rider toppled from his horse. The others shouted, scattering for cover. Clara gasped inside the cabin, clutching the blanket to her chest. Silas stepped back through the doorway, calm as if he'd swatted a fly. "Get down. Stay away from the windows." Bullets cracked against the cabin walls. The gang had opened fire, wood splintering as lead tore through it. The horse screamed in the barn, kicking wildly. Clara dropped to the floor, heart racing. Silas crouched by the window, returning fire with deadly precision. Every pull of the trigger was measured, every shot clean. He wasn't just fighting, he was reminding these men why his name carried weight across the frontier. Still, they kept coming. More shadows slipped through the trees, circling the cabin. For the first time in years, Silas realized the truth. He wasn't the one doing the hunting tonight. The gang had turned the tables. They wanted Clara. They wanted blood. And if he wasn't careful, they'd take both. Inside the cabin, Clara pressed her hands to her ears, trembling. Yet even through her fear, she watched him. Calm, unshaken, his rifle roaring like thunder. And she thought, if anyone could stand against them, it was this man. The shooting eased by dawn. The gang hadn't broken through the cabin walls, but they hadn't left either. Silas knew the type, patient, circling like wolves. They'd wait until he made a mistake. Inside, the cabin smelled of gunpowder and splintered wood. Bullet holes pocked the shutters. Clara sat on the floor with her back against the bunk, her face pale but her eyes wide and alert. She hadn't slept all night, listening to the hiss of bullets and the pounding of her own heart. Silas moved with steady precision, reloading his rifle, checking his revolvers, counting each cartridge with the same calm as if he were counting coins. His shirt was torn at the shoulder where a bullet had grazed him, but he ignored it. "You're hurt," Clara whispered. "Not enough to matter," he replied without looking up. "You make it sound so simple," she said, her voice tight. "Like bullets don't tear through flesh. Like death doesn't mean anything to you." Silas paused, then set the rifle aside. He leaned against the table, his eyes on her. "Death means plenty, but fear of it won't stop what's coming." Clara lowered her gaze, fingers twisting in the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She wanted to believe his calm, wanted to draw strength from it, but the truth weighed heavy on her. "If they want me, then I should go. Maybe they'll leave." "You be if I surrender." Silas let out a sound, half laugh, half scoff. "You think men like that leave anyone be? You walk out there, they'll put you in the ground just to prove a point. And when they're done, they'll still come for me." She blinked at him, startled. "Why?" "Because I shot one of theirs last night. Because I'm Silas Boone." His tone carried no pride, only fact. Reputation cuts both ways. It scares men off. But it also makes some fools want to be the ones who kill you. Clara studied him, her fear tempered by something else, curiosity. "Is that why you live out here alone? Because of what you've done?" For the first time since she'd met him, Silas looked away. His gaze drifted to the fire, to the smoke curling upward. The silence stretched long, heavy. "I've seen too much," he said finally. "Done too much. Makes it easier not to have anyone close." There was no bravado in his words, no boast, just weariness. A man who carried ghosts with him wherever he rode. Clara felt a pang of something she hadn't expected, pity and maybe a little understanding. "You're not as cold as you want people to think," she said softly. Silas's eyes cut back to hers, sharp again. "Don't mistake survival for kindness." But even as he said it, Clara saw the lie in his expression. He could have left her in the barn. He could have handed her over in town. Instead, he had stood between her and death. And he was still standing. The tension between them thickened, heavy as the gun smoke still clinging to the cabin walls. She feared him, yes, but she trusted him too, in a way that scared her even more. Silas turned back to the window, scanning the tree line. "They'll try again today," he muttered. Clara rose shakily to her feet, steadying herself on the bunk. "Then let me help." "You can't even stand without swaying," he said flatly. "I'm not useless," she insisted, her voice trembling but firm. "If they come inside, I won't just sit here waiting to die." Silas studied her, weighing her words. Finally, he reached into his coat and drew a small pistol, worn but reliable. He held it out. Clara hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his. The weight felt heavy, almost unbearable, but also necessary. "Don't use it unless you have to," Silas said. "But if the time comes, don't hesitate." Their eyes met then, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Two souls thrown together by fate, bound now by survival. Outside, the wolves waited. Inside, trust, fragile, uncertain, was beginning to take root. By midday, the valley lay still under the sun, its silence broken only by the caw of distant crows. Silas Boone knew better than to trust the quiet. Men like the ones hunting Clara weren't the type to ride off empty-handed. If they hadn't struck again yet, it meant they were planning something worse. He crouched near the window, scanning the tree line through the rifle's sights. Nothing moved except the wind. That was the problem. It was too still. "They're out there," Clara whispered behind him, clutching the pistol he'd given her. "I can feel it." Silas nodded slowly. "They're waiting for me to step outside. They think they'll catch me in the open." He set the rifle down and began moving around the cabin, checking the doors, placing lanterns and scraps of mirror in strategic places to catch the light. Clara frowned. "What are you doing?" "Even the odds," he said simply. "They've got numbers. I've got patience." An hour later, the trap was set. Silas had looped wire along the barn door, rigged a few bottles filled with lamp oil, near the windows, and marked every approach where a man might crawl through the grass. He wasn't just defending the cabin, he was turning it into a killing ground. When the attack came, it came fast. The first shot cracked from the ridge, shattering the water bucket near the porch. Clara dropped to the floor as bullets peppered. The walls, wood splintering around her. Silas answered with a single shot, dropping one man who thought he could creep closer under cover. Then the gang rushed. Shadows surged from the trees, 7 men, their guns blazing. Silas moved like he'd done this 100 times, and he had. He fired from the window, then rolled to the side as bullets tore through where his head had been a moment before. He lit a lantern wick and hurled it through the oil-soaked bottle by the doorway. Flames erupted, forcing 2 of the gang to scatter back, coughing and cursing. "Stay low!" he barked to Clara. She pressed against the wall, pistol clutched in. Both hands. Her heart hammered so loudly she swore the men outside could hear it. Every shot Silas fired shook her chest. Every scream from outside made her stomach turn. And yet through the haze of terror, she felt something else. A raw, desperate need to survive. One outlaw broke through the side window, shoving his way in with a snarl. Clara froze, his revolver already swinging toward her. But Silas was faster. His knife flashed in the firelight, burying itself in the man's chest before he could fire. The outlaw collapsed at Clara's feet, eyes wide in shock, blood staining the floorboards. Clara's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the pistol. Silas yanked the knife free, already turning back to the fight, his face unreadable. "Breathe, girl, you ain't dead yet." Outside, the gang regrouped, their leader shouting orders. They were angry now, reckless. Another pair rushed the porch, only to trip the wire Silas had set. A shotgun blast roared from the trap he'd rigged, scattering them like rag dolls. The fight dragged on, but little by little, Silas thinned their numbers. Each shot of his rifle was final, each trap sprung with brutal precision. Clara could barely comprehend the calm efficiency of it. This wasn't chaos to him, it was craft, a deadly art perfected over years of blood and dust. By the time the sun dipped low, the survivors had fled, leaving their dead scattered across the field. Smoke curled from the burned patch near the porch. Silence returned at last, broken only by the crackle of dying flames. Silas stood in the doorway, rifle smoking, his breath steady despite the hours of battle. Clara stared at him from the bunk, trembling, the pistol still clutched in her hands. "You," her voice broke. "You killed them all." Silas wiped the blood from his knife, his face as hard as stone. "Not all. Their leader's still out there. And he won't stop until he's got what he came for." Clara shivered, clutching the blanket tighter. The fire had driven them off for now. Night fell heavy over the valley. The cabin smelled of smoke and blood, its floor scarred with bullet holes and dark stains. Clara sat by the hearth, her hands trembling as she tried to stitch a tear in her dress, though the needle kept slipping through her fingers. The pistol still lay within reach. She didn't trust herself to put it away yet. Silas cleaned his weapons in silence. He moved methodically. Rifle, then revolvers, then the knife that had saved her life. His face was grim, his movement steady, as if battle was no more unusual to him than chopping wood. Clara watched him, fear and awe twisting inside her. Finally, she broke the silence. "You said their leader's still out there." Silas didn't look up. "Yeah, and he's meaner than the rest put together. Man like that don't give up easy." Her stomach nodded. "His name is Jeb Caro," she whispered. Silas froze mid-motion. Slowly his eyes lifted to her. "Caro?" She nodded, her throat tight. "He's the one hunting me. He's not just some outlaw. He's worse. He runs the Caro gang, out of Dry Creek." Silas's jaw clenched. He knew the name well. Jeb Caro wasn't just another bandit. He was a wolf dressed in human skin, cruel for the sake of cruelty. Whole families had vanished under his reign. Bounties had been posted on his head for years, but no hunter had yet lived to collect them. "You should have told me this from the start," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. Clara flinched at the sharpness in his tone. "I was afraid. Anyone who crosses Jeb ends up dead. I thought if I told you, you'd throw me out. Or worse, hand me over to save yourself." Silas leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "You think I scare easy?" Her voice cracked. "No. I think you've already lost too much to risk yourself for someone like me." The words cut deeper than she intended. Silas's hand stilled on the knife. He said nothing for a long while, but the firelight flickered across the hard lines of his face, revealing more than he wished. Finally, he spoke. "What did you do to make Jeb chase you across half the territory?" Clara swallowed, her throat dry as dust. The secret she'd been carrying pressed against her chest, heavy as lead. She looked at her trembling hands, then forced the words out. "I stole from him." Silas arched a brow. "Plenty of folks steal from outlaws. Not many live to tell it." "It wasn't money," Clara said quickly, shaking her head. "It was a ledger. A book he kept, filled with names, places, deals he made with corrupt lawmen and merchants. I found it hidden in his camp when I was working as a servant for one of his associates. I ran with it. I thought if I could bring it to the marshals, maybe they could finally hang him. Her voice broke into a sob. But I didn't make it. His men caught up with me before I reached town. I barely escaped alive. And now he'll never stop until he gets it back. Silas's eyes darkened like storm clouds. Where's the ledger now? Clara looked toward her satchel, shoved into the corner of the cabin. In there, wrapped in cloth. I never let it go. For the first time, Silas let out a low whistle. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You don't realize what you've done, girl. That ledger ain't just evidence. It's a death sentence for Caro if it gets into the right hands. He'll burn the whole territory to ash before he lets you deliver it. Clara met his gaze, her eyes wide but determined. Then I need your help. Please. If we can make it to the marshals in Silverton, Jeb won't be able to touch me. Not if the law's got proof of his crimes. Silas stared at her for a long, tense moment. Then he stood, holstering his revolvers, with a decisive snap. Silverton's 2 days' ride through hard country. Caro's men'll be thick on the trail. Does that mean you'll take me? She asked, her voice trembling with hope. He gave her a look that was equal parts, warning and promise. It means I'll see this through, but you better be ready. Once we ride, there ain't no turning back. Clara clutched the satchel to her chest, her heart hammering. For the first time since her nightmare began, she felt a spark of something, like courage. But outside, in the dark woods beyond the cabin, Jeb Caro's men were already gathering. And the noose was tightening. The night had not yet surrendered to dawn, and Silverton lay under a blanket of uneasy silence. Silas Kane guided his horse down the deserted street with Clara riding close behind, her arms wrapped around the satchel that held the ledger. Every creak of saddle leather, every hollow echo of hooves on dirt sounded too loud, as though the whole town were listening. He dismounted by the marshal's office, scanning the rooftops and alleyways. His hand hovered over the butt of his Colt out of habit. Clara's breath was shallow. Fear clung to her like a second skin. Inside, the marshal sat slumped over his desk, spectacles low on his nose. When he saw Silas, his eyes widened. "Kane," he said slowly, as though unsure whether to be relieved or afraid. "What trouble's riding in with you this time?" "Not mine," Silas said curtly, nodding at Clara. "Hers, and yours if you're smart enough to see it." Clara opened the satchel with trembling fingers and slid the ledger across the desk. The marshal flipped through, his jaw tightening at the names, numbers, and blood money sprawled across the pages. "This'll bury Jeb Caro," he muttered, "but it'll paint a target on anyone who touches it." Before Silas could reply, the window behind them shattered. A bullet whined past Clara's ear and buried itself in the wall. She screamed and dropped to the floor. "Hell," Silas growled, pulling his guns. "They're already here." The office filled with gunfire. Glass shattered, wood splintered, the air reeked of powder. The marshal grabbed his shotgun, but he was old, too slow to keep up with men bred for killing. Silas pushed Clara toward the back door. "Move!" he barked. "But the ledger?" she started. "I ain't leaving it," he snapped. He tucked the satchel under his arm, dragging her out into the alley as another volley of bullets shredded the marshal's door. Silverton's streets were alive now, shadows slipping between buildings, riders circling like wolves. And then he saw him, Jeb Caro, standing tall in the middle of the street, his face lit by lantern light. The gang leader's grin was wide, cruel. "Well, well," Caro drawled. "The ghost of the frontier himself, playing hero to a girl. Hand her over, Kane. You walk away, ledger and all, and I'll forget this insult." Clara gripped Silas's coat, her voice barely a whisper. "He'll kill us both." Silas stood still, every muscle coiled. He thought of all the years he'd lived alone, all the bounties claimed, all the blood spilled for gold. None of it had ever mattered, not really. And now here was this girl, trembling behind him, trusting him with everything she had left. He spoke, his voice steady as steel. "You want her, Caro? Then you'll have to put me in the ground." The gang hooted and jeered, but Caro's smirk faded. He studied Silas a long moment, then his hand dropped to his pistol. The street went silent. The draw was fast, too fast for most eyes to follow. But when the dust cleared, Caro lay in the dirt, blood pooling beneath him. Silas hadn't moved from where he stood, smoke curling from the barrel of his Colt. The gang scattered in a panic. Without their leader, they were nothing but cowards fleeing into the hills. Clara collapsed against him, sobbing with relief. "You could have walked away. You could have let them take me." Silas looked down at her, his expression softer than it had been in years. "Reckon I've walked away too many times in my life. Not this time." The marshal staggered out onto the street, deputies gathering in the aftermath. He clutched the ledger like a holy book. "This town owes you both," he said. "Justice will see Caro's men hang." But Clara wasn't listening. Her eyes were on Silas, the man once feared as the coldest killer alive, who had chosen her over safety, over gold, over everything. When they rode out of Silverton at first light, dawn spilled gold across the horizon. For the first time in years, Silas Kane didn't feel like a man running from his past. He felt like a man who had finally chosen a future, one not written in blood, but in law.